Dad told me to go live in the streets because I'd never succeed. 3 weeks later, I walked into dinner, slid a folder across the table, and changed their lives forever. I'll start with the porch because that's where everything actually began, even though it felt like an ending at the time. 2 garbage bags, both black. One had my clothes, the other had everything else I own that fit: laptop charger, some books, a framed photo of nobody important. My father stood in the doorway behind me. The rain was coming down at an angle, the kind that gets under your collar no matter which way you turn. I didn't turn around. I picked up both bags, walked to my car, put them in the trunk, and drove away. That's the whole scene. No screaming, no dramatic last look at the house. Just a man carrying his own bags to his own car while his family watched from inside where it was dry. Let me back up. 3 years before that night, I founded a company called Havane Energy. Not an app, not a subscription service. Actual infrastructure, small-scale wind grid systems for rural municipalities that couldn't afford utility-scale solutions. I had contracts. I had engineers. I had a letter of intent from a county energy board in western Pennsylvania that would have been our first anchor client, enough to prove the model and raise a proper Series A. Then there was a local election. The incoming county commissioner ran on a platform that included scrapping the renewable pilot program. He won by 600 votes. The letter of intent became worthless paper in about 72 hours. The investors I'd been in conversations with didn't pull out dramatically. They just stopped returning calls. That's how it ends, usually. Not a crash, just silence. I wasn't broke. I had savings. I had a brain that still worked. What I didn't have was a place to think clearly while I figured out the next move. My apartment lease was expiring. I needed 30 days, maybe 60, to regroup. So I went home. I should explain what home meant in the context of the Hale family. My father, Warren, built a regional car dealership network over 30 years. 4 locations, good volume, solid name in the area. He did it through connections and stubbornness more than anything else, but he'd done it, and he never let anyone forget that. My older brother Colt ran his own construction company, residential and light commercial, and operated as Warren's mirror image in every way that mattered to Warren. Loud, certain of himself, good at the performance of success. I was always the other one, the one who read too much, asked too many questions, thought too carefully before speaking. Warren used to say I had the wrong kind of ambition, meaning I wanted to build something outside his orbit. He never said that was the problem, but it always was. I came home on a Thursday. By Sunday, Warren had organized a dinner. That should have been my signal. Warren didn't do casual. Every meal in that house had a structure. Who sat where, who spoke when, what the point of the gathering was. I walked into the dining room and found 2 of his business associates already seated at the table. Men I recognized but didn't know well. They had the polite, careful expressions of people who've been told something interesting is about to happen. Colt was already grinning when I sat down. Warren waited until the food was on the table. Then he folded his hands, looked at me, and said he thought it was important for the family to understand the full picture of what had happened with my company. He said it the way a judge reads a charge. Clinical, deliberate. What followed was 20 minutes of me explaining a business collapse to people who had no real interest in understanding it. Every time I gave context, Warren reframed it as an excuse. Every time I mentioned the contract loss, Colt called it a single customer dependency problem, like he'd read that phrase somewhere and had been waiting to use it. He called Havane Energy a hobby project twice. He said participation trophy startup once and laughed at his own line. Warren's associates smiled at appropriate moments. Norma sat at the far end of the table and looked at her food. When Warren finished, he told me I was bleeding the family name by associating failure with the Hale identity. He told me I had 2 hours to get my things out of the guest room. His exact final words I've already told you. I didn't respond. I packed. I stood on the porch in the rain with 2 bags and got in my car. At a motel 40 minutes away, I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop open, not out of any plan, just restless habit. I started pulling up public filings on Warren's dealership group, the way you pick at something without knowing why. 20 minutes in, I found a supplier payment listed under a company name I didn't recognize. Ridgemont Capital Holdings. I typed it into the state business registry. The registration date, the listed agent, the address, everything about it was slightly wrong in a way that shouldn't have been possible for a legitimate holding entity connected to a dealership operation. I opened a new spreadsheet and started pulling at the thread. Ridgemont Capital Holdings was incorporated 11 years ago. Listed agent was a law firm I'd never heard of, based 2 states over. The registered address was a commercial suite in an office park, the kind of address that exists solely to receive mail and appear on documents. No website, no employees on record, no public-facing identity of any kind. On its own, none of that is illegal. Plenty of legitimate holding entities look exactly like that. But when I cross-referenced the name against Warren's dealership group filings, something didn't line up. Ridgemont was listed as a vendor, receiving supplier payments from the dealership's operating accounts. Except it wasn't a vendor. It wasn't selling anything. There was no product, no service description, no contract reference number attached to any of the payments. It was just receiving money. I stayed up until 4 in the morning. Then I called Doyle, Doyle had been my CFO at Havane Energy for the last 18 months of its life. Certified public accountant, former auditor, the kind of person who finds numerical inconsistencies the way other people find typos, automatically, without trying. When the company folded, he went freelance. We'd stayed in contact. When I told him what I'd found, he went quiet for a long moment and then said, "Send me everything you have and give me 3 days." He came back in 2. What he laid out over a 4-hour call was not a simple cash skimming operation. It was a layered structure that had clearly been refined over time. Ridgemont Capital Holdings functioned as a shadow ledger for Warren's dealership group. Money moved from the dealership's operating accounts into Ridgemont under the classification of management consulting fees and administrative services. Vague enough to survive a casual look. Specific enough to appear intentional if you knew what you were reading. The total over 11 years, conservatively estimated from the public filings alone, was just under $2 million. That was just Warren's side. Colt's company, Hale Build Company, had its own problem. Doyle flagged it separately, almost as an aside. Like he was embarrassed it had taken him that long to notice. Colt had won 4 municipal subcontracting bids over the past 6 years. Standard stuff: road resurfacing, a public park renovation, a school building upgrade. The bid bonds on 2 of those contracts had been issued by a bonding company that, when Doyle dug into its licensure history, had been operating under a suspended certificate in this state for 14 months during the period the bonds were issued. Colt had used invalid bonds to secure government contracts. That wasn't a paperwork error, that was fraud. The school renovation was the worst one. Doyle found payment flows from that contract cycling through a secondary LLC that Colt co-owned with a man named Ferris, a name that appeared nowhere on any public-facing Hale Build Company document. Money from a public school contract was being split between Colt and a silent partner through an entity that had no stated business purpose. I sat with all of this for a full day before I let myself think about what it meant. What it meant was simple. My father had spent 20 minutes at a dinner table dissecting my failure in front of witnesses while sitting on top of a decade's worth of financial fraud. My brother had laughed at my participation trophy startup while running bid rigging schemes on government school contracts. The hypocrisy wasn't even the part that got to me. What got to me was how clean they felt about it. How completely comfortable. Warren had looked at me like I was the embarrassment. I called a real estate attorney named Petra Was. She'd been recommended by a former investor contact, described as someone who understood how distressed assets and over-leveraged property structures worked. I sent her Doyle's summary the night before our meeting. She read it in front of me, slowly, without reacting. When she finished, she set the papers down, looked up, and said I had enough to go to regulators immediately. She said she could have notifications drafted and filed by Thursday. I told her I didn't want to notify anyone. Not yet. She tilted her head, not confused, just recalibrating. I slid a notepad across her desk. 1 sentence written on it. She read it, looked up at me. Then, for the first time in the meeting, she smiled. The sentence on the notepad read, "I don't want them punished. I want them dismantled." There's a difference. Punishment is fast and visible and gives the other person something to react to. They lawyer up, they fight, they reframe themselves as victims of a vindictive son with an axe to grind. Warren would have been on television inside a week talking about family disputes and overzealous regulators. Colt would have cried in front of someone. Dismantling is different. Dismantling is quiet. It works from the inside, along the existing fault lines, and by the time the structure starts visibly failing, nobody can point to a single cause because the whole thing is just falling, the way things fall when they were never as solid as they looked. Petra understood that immediately. That's why she smiled. We spent the next 2 weeks mapping the sequence. Not what to expose, we already knew that, but the order. Which pressure point, applied when, would produce the maximum cascading effect without triggering a defensive response too early. It was less like planning a confrontation and more like planning a controlled demolition. You don't blow the whole building at once. You take out the supports in the right order and let physics do the rest. The first move was Colt's bonding certificate. I didn't report him to any regulator. I didn't contact the county. What I did was reach out, through a mid-sized insurance intermediary Petra knew, to the bonding company directly. I flagged a documentation irregularity on the certificate used for the school renovation contract. I framed it as a compliance concern from an anonymous industry contact. Routine, dry, impossible to trace. The bonding company ran their own internal review. Within 11 days, the certificate was voided retroactively. The county facilities board was notified as a matter of procedure. The school renovation contract was suspended pending investigation of the bond validity. Colt woke up one morning to a certified letter and a frozen project. As far as he knew, it was a bureaucratic problem, a paperwork issue, the kind of thing that gets fixed with a few phone calls. He made the calls. Nothing moved. The second move was the supplier. Warren's dealership inventory pipeline ran through 2 primary suppliers. His floor plan financing, The credit line that let him stock vehicles without buying them outright depended entirely on those relationships remaining stable. I didn't touch the financing directly. Instead, through a financial research contact Doyle maintained from his auditing days, I surfaced a quiet credit inquiry that flagged Ridgemont Capital Holdings as an entity with unusual exposure relative to the dealership's stated balance sheet. It wasn't an accusation. It was a data point, the kind that lands on a risk analyst's desk and generates a flag. One of the suppliers paused new inventory shipments within 3 weeks. Internal review, they said. Temporary. Warren started calling everyone he knew. Nobody could give him a clean answer because nobody had done anything. They were just reacting to information. The machine slowed without anyone pulling a visible lever. The third move was the estate. Petra sent structured legal inquiries, framed as due diligence on behalf of an anonymous prospective buyer evaluating a potential acquisition of an adjacent property, to each of the 3 lenders holding liens on the Hale family estate. The inquiries raised a straightforward question. Could each lender confirm their lien position relative to any other recorded encumbrances? None of them could, because all 3 believed they held senior position. None of them did exclusively. All 3 froze further credit extensions while their legal teams assessed. One of them filed a declaratory action to establish lien priority. That filing became public record. During all of this, I was working. A regional infrastructure investment firm had hired me as a senior consultant to assess rural energy grid contracts in 3 states. It was exactly the kind of work I'd been building toward with Havane, just from the inside of an established operation rather than a startup. I went to meetings. I wrote assessments. I ate dinner alone most nights and followed the news from Warren's world through public filings and Petra's updates. Then my phone rang. Norma, she said Warren was stressed, that the business was having a difficult stretch, that he believed someone might be deliberately targeting the dealership. I told her that sounded stressful. She asked if I was coming home for the holidays. I said I'd think about it. I hung up and opened a text to Petra. Accelerate. Accelerate meant removing the buffer between moves. Up until that point, I'd been spacing each action deliberately, weeks between pressure points, enough time for each one to settle into its own category in Warren and Colt's minds before the next problem appeared. Keeping them separate meant keeping them manageable. Individual crises, isolated fires. Accelerate meant letting them overlap. Colt's situation moved first. The county facilities board investigation into the voided bond had been moving slowly, the way government processes do. But when Petra's firm submitted a public records request for documentation related to the school renovation contract, it shook something loose. A former subcontractor on that project, a man who'd had his final payment held back by Hale Build Company for 7 months over a fabricated punch list dispute, saw the public records activity and contacted the licensing board directly. He had his own documentation, invoices, emails, a detailed record of the payment dispute that painted a clear picture of how Colt operated. The licensing board opened a secondary inquiry. Within 2 weeks, Colt's contractor license was suspended pending full investigation. He couldn't bid on new work. His active contracts were put under review. His crew, who hadn't been paid on schedule in 3 weeks, started walking. Colt called me on a Wednesday evening. He didn't know I was behind anything. As far as he was concerned, I was just his brother who used to run a company and might know how to navigate business problems. He sat in his truck outside my rental and talked for 40 minutes. He said it felt like everything was hitting at once. He said the licensing issue had to be a mistake, that someone had it out for him, that the subcontractor was a liar with a grudge. I listened, gave him coffee when he came inside, asked 2 or 3 questions that sounded like I was trying to understand the situation but were actually confirming details Doyle hadn't been able to verify from public records alone. Colt left without anything useful. At the door, he looked at me with something I hadn't seen on him before. Not quite shame. More like the specific discomfort of a person who has always assumed the world is structured in his favor suddenly noticing that assumption has weight to it. I locked the door and updated Doyle's file. Warren's dealership collapse accelerated the same week. The floor plan lender who'd received the credit flag about Ridgemont issued a formal notice of covenant breach. It cited the lien irregularities on the estate as evidence that Warren's stated asset position had been misrepresented on the original financing application. Warren's attorney tried to negotiate. He couldn't produce clean documentation on Ridgemont because clean documentation didn't exist. The lender sent 2 auditors to the dealership on a Tuesday morning to begin an on-site review of receivables and inventory records. Warren physically escorted them out of the building. Someone in the parking lot recorded it on their phone. It wasn't a dramatic video, just a 60-year-old man in a good suit telling 2 men with briefcases to get off his property. But context is everything. And by the time it circulated through the local community pages, enough people knew about the lien dispute from the public filing to understand what they were watching. The comments were not kind. The lien situation had already attracted attention beyond the lenders. A financial blogger who covered regional business news ran a short item under the headline, Hale family estate at center of multi-lender dispute. Nothing defamatory, just facts pulled from public court records. But the Hale name had meant something in this area for 30 years, and that headline was the first time it appeared next to the word dispute in print. I read it over breakfast and felt nothing in particular. That was the part I hadn't fully anticipated. How little satisfaction the individual moments would carry. Not because the plan wasn't working, because I'd stopped needing the satisfaction. The work was its own thing by then. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at my rental. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Handwritten, Warren's handwriting. I recognized the particular heaviness of it from every birthday card that had ever felt more like a receipt than a sentiment. It said, "Whatever you think you know, be careful. Some doors shouldn't be opened." I photographed it, sent it to Petra with one line. "He knows something. Time to finish it." Then I called Doyle. "Set up the dinner," I said. I sent my mother a message the following Monday. Short, no explanation attached. Just that I'd come for dinner on Saturday, and that I'd be bringing 2 colleagues who were helping me with a current project. She responded within 4 minutes, said she'd make enough for everyone. Warren would have read that message within the hour. I knew how that house worked. The 2 weeks between sending that message and showing up at the door were the most focused I'd felt since before Havain collapsed. Petra and Doyle and I worked through the final document package with the kind of precision that leaves no room for interpretation. Every page sequenced, every attachment cross-referenced. We weren't building a case for a courtroom. We were building something that only needed to be understood once, in one room, by 3 people who had spent years believing they were untouchable. The estate document was the last one assembled and the first one I thought about every morning. Here is what had happened. From the beginning, Warren had layered 3 separate loans against the family estate using inflated appraisals produced through Ridgemont Capital Holdings. Each lender believed they held senior lien position. None of them did exclusively. When the declaratory action was filed and the lender's attorneys began communicating with each other, Warren's own attorney advised him, correctly, under the circumstances, that a voluntary deed in lieu arrangement with the senior lien holder would stop the bleeding. It would surrender the property directly to that lien holder, avoiding a prolonged public foreclosure process that would destroy whatever remained of the Hale name in the area. Warren agreed, signed the paperwork his attorney put in front of him. Probably felt like he was making a hard but rational business decision. The senior lien holder who received the deed was a holding company called Arville Property Trust. Petra had capitalized and structured Arville Property Trust 8 weeks earlier on my behalf. Warren had signed his family home to his son without knowing his son's name was anywhere near the transaction. I put that document at the bottom of the folder. Saturday came. I drove myself. Black SUV, bought outright 2 months ago, not to make an entrance, just because I'd needed a reliable vehicle and had the money. Doyle rode with me. Petra sent a junior associate from her firm, a composed young woman named Foss, who carried the second briefcase and had been briefed to say nothing unless directly asked a legal question. I wore a black suit because I had a meeting immediately after and because I'd earned it. When I turned onto the long driveway of the Hale estate, I noticed Warren's car parked at an angle, not the way he usually parked, perfectly straight against the edge of the drive, and I understood he was rattled before I'd even opened my door. Norma met me at the entrance. She held on slightly longer than usual when she hugged me. Warren appeared behind her and shook my hand the way you shake hands with someone you're still trying to read. Colt appeared in the hallway and made a comment about the full production of my arrival. I didn't look at him when I said, "Sit down, Colt." He laughed, but he sat. Dinner was real. Norma cooked. We talked about the garden, about winter, about nothing that mattered. Warren tried twice to steer the conversation toward business, toward his situation, toward what I might know, toward feeling out the edges of my involvement. I didn't take either opening. I ate. I asked Norma about the azaleas she'd planted along the back fence the previous spring. I waited. After the plates were cleared, I set the folder on the table. No explanation, no preamble. I slid it across to Warren and said, "You should look at that." He opened it. Colt leaned in from his chair. I watched their faces the way you watch a building come down, not with excitement, just with the quiet attention of someone who measured the charges and knows exactly what's going to happen. Page by page, Ridgemont, the cash flows, the mislabeled payments, the inflated appraisals, Colt's voided bonding certificates, the school contract payment structure, the IRS referral Petra had filed 2 days prior as a matter of legal obligation. All of it annotated, dated, cross-referenced. And then the final page. Warren stared at it for a long time. The deed transfer, Arville Property Trust, his own signature at the bottom, notarized, dated 3 weeks ago. When he looked up, something behind his eyes had gone completely still. "How did you get this?" His voice came out wrong, too careful. The voice of a man who has just understood the full shape of something and is hoping he's misread it. "Carefully," I said. He stood up slowly. The folder was in his hand. He set it back on the table with deliberate control and then looked at me with something I recognized. It was the same energy from the Sunday dinner months ago, the same impulse to make me small in a room. But the room had changed. The room was no longer his. "You want to destroy this family?" His voice dropped low. "Over what?" Because I threw you out? You're going to burn all of this down over your ego? I looked at him for a long moment. Doyle and Foss sat perfectly still. I haven't burned anything, Dad, I said. Everything in that folder burned itself. I just kept the record. His mouth opened, then closed. Then something left his face entirely. The performance of it, the control, the decades of certainty that he was the one who decided what things meant in this family. What came out next was barely above a whisper. What do you want from us? I'd thought about this moment more times than I'd admit to anyone. Not obsessively. I wasn't sitting in motel rooms imagining speeches. But in the quiet spaces, driving between meetings, eating alone, waiting for Petra's updates, the question had surfaced on its own. What do you actually say when you finally get there? When the person who threw you out in the rain is sitting across a dinner table that technically belongs to you now, asking what you want. I'd imagined versions where I laid out everything he'd done wrong as a father. Versions where I made him repeat back what he'd said on the porch. Versions where I handed him a number, a dollar figure, a buyback price for the estate, something that forced him to pay in a way he'd feel every month. None of that was what came out. I leaned back in my chair, let the silence sit for a moment without filling it. Nothing, I said. Watching this happen is enough. Warren didn't move. Norma, still seated at the far end of the table, set her hands flat on the surface like she needed something solid. I kept my voice even and went through it the way I'd go through a project closeout with a client. Sequential, clear, no editorializing. The IRS referral Petra had filed was not a threat. It was a legal obligation once the Ridgemont structure had been fully documented. That process would run its own course over the next 18 to 24 months. Warren's best available option was voluntary disclosure through independent legal counsel, beginning immediately, before the audit deepened into territory that would expose the full 11-year timeline. Whether he took that option was entirely his decision. I wasn't offering guidance. I was explaining the landscape. The state licensing board investigation into Hale Build Company would conclude on its own schedule. The subcontractor's testimony and documentation were already on record. Colt's path back to a full license would depend on how the board assessed his cooperation and whether any of the affected contracts resulted in civil claims. Again, his decision, his process. The estate was the simplest part to explain because there was nothing left to negotiate. Arville Property Trust held the deed. That was a settled legal fact. What I told them, and this was the only decision I'd made that surprised even Petra, was that I had no intention of removing anyone from the property. I wasn't moving in. I wasn't selling it. What I was doing was converting it to a lease arrangement, managed through Petra's firm, at fair market rate for the area. Warren would pay rent on the house he built, to an entity I controlled. Not forever, just for as long as it took for the lesson to become something he carried in his body rather than just his memory. Colt hadn't said a word since I'd answered Warren's question. He was looking at the folder, still open on the table, at nothing in particular. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual weight. You did all of this alone? I looked at him directly. You laughed, I said. That was the whole answer. He understood it. I could see it land somewhere real. Norma walked me to the door while Doyle and Foss collected the briefcase materials in the dining room. She didn't make excuses. She didn't explain her silence on the porch that night or at the dinner table before it. She just walked beside me through the hallway of the house she no longer owned and stopped at the door. I should have said something that night, she said. Yes, I said. She asked if I'd come back sometime. I told her I didn't know. She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected and maybe the one she deserved. I walked to the car. Doyle and Foss came out 2 minutes later. Nobody spoke on the drive back. That was 8 months ago. Warren took the voluntary disclosure advice. He hired a tax attorney and entered a negotiated resolution with the IRS that took most of his liquid assets to settle. The dealership network was restructured under a creditor agreement, 2 locations closed, 2 operating under new financing terms. The Hale name is still above the door on one of them. I don't know if that matters to him or not. Colt's license was restored with conditions 6 months after the board concluded its review. He's doing small residential work now. No government contracts, no municipal bids. He called me once, about 3 months ago, and we spoke for maybe 10 minutes. He didn't apologize exactly. He said he'd been thinking about how things went. I told him I had too. We left it there. The estate lease went into effect the first of the following month. Warren makes the payment on time, every month, through a property management portal Petra's firm set up. I don't look at the transactions. My accountant does. I went back to the work. The infrastructure firm extended my contract and then offered me a full partner role in their rural energy division, which I accepted. Real contracts, real engineering. My name isn't famous. I'm not on any lists. I don't particularly want to be. People ask me sometimes, friends, colleagues, Doyle over dinner once, whether I feel like I won, whether it felt the way I thought it would. The honest answer is that it didn't feel like winning. It felt like accuracy, like a number that finally balances after years of carrying a discrepancy you couldn't name. My father told me I'd never make it without the family. He was half right. I didn't make it without something, just not the something he was thinking of. Turns out all I needed was the thing he handed me when he threw me out into the rain that night, a reason to stop being careful. Grayson, Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you really like our videos, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Have a great day.